the replacing of God with government that we saw in totalitarian states. That's the end. It's seeing people primarily not as economic creatures, but as spiritual creatures.
John, the first question today has to do with a very real concern for those of us Christians who are in the public sphere in ministries like this one, communicating messages that are countercultural, or at least run contrary to the mainstream of our culture, and are using platforms that are run by people who predominantly disagree very strongly with us. This listener writes in, as we see more and more corporations being pressured to go woke and give in to the left's agenda and their willingness to become slaves to it, do you think this is a way for the left to seize the means of production as socialism would? Obviously, capitalism is so embedded in American society that government seizure of the means of production is too lofty a goal. But could it happen in a soft power way through woke coercion? There's a phrase. And do you think this is what they're trying to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. Whenever I hear questions like this, I often want to ask in response, who's they?
Right.
Which they are we talking about? And look, it's not because I don't think there are a they. We just need to be clear on who they are. And what I mean by there's, I believe that there is a they. There are people who have very different ideas about the way the church should be run, the way that family should be done, the way that education should be done, the way that government should manage the economy, or what laws the government should pass. There are people that have very clear ideas. A lot of these people are on Twitter with no power whatsoever. Some of these people are in Congress and they have a lot of power. Some of these people are funders that set up PACs and super PACs and influence local races and have flipped entire states, including my own of Colorado. And so, but I think it's inaccurate to say, and it's not really helpful to say that all of they are on the same page. So, for example, even in the LGBTQ acronym, as we've said before, you can't say that the L's and the T's are part of the same they. At least they don't want to say they're part of the same they, because they really don't like each other.
Right.
Because although they have common goals here, they have very different goals there. The other question I often want to ask too is what's the means and what's the end? So let's say somebody does, in fact, have an agenda and a goal for America. Rarely it encompasses all the things that are part of the left. One of the things that David Noble, the founder of Summit Ministry, used to do with the students is outline, kind of the difference between left and right theologically, economically, politically, and it was just really helpful to see that these are distinct categories of thought. Now, sometimes they come in package deals, but not everyone's consistent in that way, particularly the power brokers. The other question is, what's the means and what's the ends? In other words, it seems like for this questioner, the means of production, seizing the means of productions and pushing America to socialism, that's the ultimate end. And then anything else that's done is a means to accomplish that end. And I'm not sure that's always the case. I think for
Right.
many people on the left side of the spectrum, the progressive side of the spectrum, they're going to disagree on means and ends. And a lot of times that's where things really go bad. I think what we've seen in history, at least in recent history, and by recent, I don't mean like in the last 20 years, I mean in the last 150 years, that a government seizing the means of production is a recipe for failure across the board. Now, there's plenty of millennials and Gen Zers that don't have a cultural memory, for example, of communism, and they're more than willing to give it a try. So, like, let's try communism again. There's even some professors, and I've heard about these folks who say, well, communism wasn't really tried in the 20th century. We'll get it right this time.
That wasn't
which
real
is
communism.
yeah, that wasn't real communism. The kind that kills
Yeah.
people isn't the real communism. But that those are just kind of absurd opinions and beliefs that don't have any bearing in history or in fact. Or it is an opinion that is born out of having no sense of history, which I think younger Americans who would, on a survey, tell the New York Times that I think the government should run the
Well,
means of production.
it's also based on a conflation of the Nordic model, what we call socialism and communism. So a lot of people on both sides of the aisle sort of make that conflation, but it's not a fair one to make at all. I mean, in the Nordic model countries, Scandinavia, the socialism, quote unquote, there is really capitalism with a big welfare state, and that's kind of how it's run. It's not run on the basis of seizing the means of production or anything like that. I don't hear a lot of people who will come out and openly advocate, yeah, Soviet communism, that's what we want. We want to go to that model. I don't see that a lot. I see a lot of people saying we need a bigger
Man,
welfare
I
state.
drove in a Soviet era taxi cab many, many times in Jamaica, and trust me, you do not want you do not want government means of productions. This idea that no matter how hard people work, they'll all get paid the same. And somehow
Right.
that will ensure quality control was just the kind of the worst idea ever.
How did a
And I think
Soviet era cab end up in Jamaica?
Oh, it's a great story. It's Jamaica's number one export is bauxite, which is an ingredient for aluminum, and the Russians paid Jamaica with taxi cabs called Ladas, and they're literally boxes on wheels. In those those cartoons when you see like a car rushing around the mountain on those tight curvy roads, and the
Yep.
whole car kind of extends out like a slinky and
Right.
then snaps. Ladas actually do that. I've been in them. They actually do that. And of course, in the Jamaican way of doing things, in this car that should hold maybe five people if you're crowded. I mean, I've ridden in those things with nine. I mean,
We
it's
be
just,
jamming, man.
oh man, it's an experience that I'll never forget and will never want to repeat. But the yeah, I think your point too about the socialism of the kind of the Nordic socialism and the communism is an important distinction because it does have to do with how much government regulation, how much government control, how much of corporate profit goes to the state, what that does to, for example, charitable giving. All of these things are really interesting as opposed to government means of production. And listen, the current model that we have now with corporate taxes would have been unthinkable in American history
Sure.
until recently. And I think it's important, and I get the concern behind this question because as even the Robinhood newsletter, Robinhood, it's the platform that allows young investors to get into the stock market. They have a newsletter. They did an assessment this week of President Biden's first 100 days and said, he ran as a moderate, but his economic policies have been very progressive and very far left. Certainly talking about the trial balloons that he floated about raising capital gains, and certainly, this infrastructure bill, which is 5% in infrastructure and 95%, Green New Deal, essentially. So these are very socialistic leaning sorts of economic policies. And or on that spectrum is headed to the left, not headed to the right. So I understand the concern, but I do think that means an end question, Shane, is an important one because I think government seizing control of production is not the end.
Hmm.
The replacing of God with government that we saw in totalitarian states, that's the end. It's seeing people primarily not as economic creatures but as spiritual creatures, as worshipers. To bring in, for example, Saint Augustine or others, that who we really are fundamentally are worshipers. And if you're really going to govern behavior, that's the end.
Hmm.
And I'd say I'm way more concerned about an educational system that catechizes young people that there's no God, that there's no design to their bodies. It's a short step to denying creation, to denying the creator. And we've done that scientifically, and now we're doing it socially, relationally, anthropologically, developmentally, socially, reproductively. I mean, you name it in all these anthropological sort of ways. That would seem to me to be a far more effective strategy of the ultimate enemy, the ultimate, not they, but it, the prince of darkness, Satan. That would seem to be a more accurate description of what his goal is.
Did you just say the Prince of Darkness is a clown?
A clown? Who said a clown?
Yeah, you said it. I'm picturing Satan down in a gutter now
Oh,
saying,
I
"Hey,
think
hey,
yeah,
Georgie."
yeah. No, I said it not because of Stephen King. How do you gender Satan? This is a good question.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the Bible uses the he language, but who knows if that's accurate in the angelic
Yeah,
realm?
I think there's isn't there a pretty, most depictions throughout history, I think, especially of, Dante and others, don't they have them pretty, ambiguous, in terms of, gender?
It's certainly the case in the Passion of the Christ.
Boy, that wasn't
That
it?
was a
Oh my
weird
goodness.
one. Yeah, that was like anticipating some of the weirdest stuff that you see at like transgender marches and stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
it was bizarre. Um, Getting back to the question here real quickly, John, I don't think this is as much a conspiracy, so much as people just pushing their values, people in power. And it was specifically about corporations. And I think what's being pushed, if you look at the broad picture of woke corporate America, which what a surprise, conservatives were always the pro economic freedom, pro business people, and then all of a sudden, bam, all the major corporations go completely left socially. But what's being pushed really is not an economic project so much as a social project to me. And there's been some fascinating speculation over the years certainly since 2015 with Obergefell, about why corporate America has really jumped behind this revisionist social agenda, particularly with regard to sex and gender and family and the reworking of those norms. And the speculation I saw that really seemed like it hit the mark was that corporations have a strong economic interest in reinforcing a very rootless, fruitless, womb to tomb, consumer centric lifestyle. So the idea of people as isolated individuals expressing themselves and their sexuality and then communicating those things, those choices in terms of consumption and the choices they make about how to express that and how to live it out, and what technologies to take advantage of to mimic a natural family. All of these things play well into the hands of the corporation of corporate America's general mindset for a consumer, the kind of person they want to be buying from them. Just
Do you
like,
think they're aware of that? I mean, do you think like board members that are making these decisions
oh, I doubt it.
are really thinking profit first?
I doubt they're thinking in those terms explicitly, but I do think there's probably a subconscious perception that a certain type of person is a better customer long term than the person who has a bunch of mediating institutions and other strong, robust spheres in their lives to go to. Who has church and family and voluntary associations and things like that. Just like we talk about how the thinning of society creates a growing government, it seems that we've also entered a phase where it creates a growing mega corporation economy. We're not, by corporations here, we're not talking about, your local mom and pop shop down the street. We're talking about mega corporations that have in many ways taken on a role that's analogous to what governments historically did, to where now they're regulating what's reasonable in terms of speech and opinion and all that. And I think of, Google comes to mind, and then the social media giants. Uh, we've seen these corporations clash on a social level with with players in the marketplace of ideas who have ideas they don't like. So, Prager University comes to mind. They've got this ongoing battle over the censorship and demonetization. They call it censorship. Of course, and it's technically voluntary because it's an association, or it's a corporation they're dealing with. But as we talked about a couple weeks ago, John, there does come a point where you have to begin to ask tough questions about the power of a corporation. How big does a corporation have to be, and how pervasive does its influence in society have to be before it functionally acts like a government in its power to shut down
Yeah,
differing opinions?
there's a lot of this that's just unprecedented, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we haven't seen any form. You can go back to the heyday of GM or the
Mhm.
recreation of, Dodge Chrysler, or, name it. Any of the big retailers. J.C. Penney in its heyday didn't have near the influence or power over shaping so much of our behavior. I was actually talking to my a relative about this. He's involved in the in RV sales,
Hmm.
and talking about how during the pandemic it's been really good for that business. But just even the behavior, the idea of people shopping online, buying something on that expensive online without going to see it. And like, well, they're doing that with homes in this area, right? I mean, there's just, but all of that behavior, none of that's possible or thinkable. It's not possible to think about being a consumer that way if you weren't already catechized in some way by Amazon. But I buy that thesis that in a world reshaped the way that ours does, there's not really a thought of profit first, or there's a thought of seeing people
Hmm.
primarily as a consumer. It's just a vision of people that seem to make the most sense. I can buy that completely. It's the undercurrent, right? It's the
Mhm.
that we talk about in on Breakpoint and in other places. It's the assumed ideas that Lewis talks about. I can buy that.
I think it was in the American Conservative back in 2015 or 16. There was an essay along these lines. It's like, why did corporate America line up behind gay marriage? And they give the explanation that I forget who wrote it, but this author gives the explanation that I'm giving right here, and we'll probably be able to find that and link it in the show notes. But yeah, I hope that answers the question, or at least begins to gesture toward an answer to the question. It's a good one, and it's one that has caused me a lot of hard thinking in terms of what does economic freedom look like in a world as unprecedented as ours, where corporations are policing speech and changing opinion and even changing the way that elections go and governments are constituted. It's a good one.